Welcome again. This is Mideast Realities, and I'm your host, Mark Bruzonsky. And this week we have a gentleman with us who I've known for a very long time. He's been involved in Middle East affairs, in fact, since before I was born. You were just reminding me that you were in San Francisco back when the UN was being set up.
Right.
Dr. Alfred Lilienthal, a gentleman who just about everybody who has studied Middle East affairs knows. He's published 5 books, 4 of which are on our table here. He's been involved in commenting about the Middle East situation for about 40 years.
That's right.
And he is one of the most outspoken Jewish personalities who, from day one, opposed the creation of an exclusive Jewish state in Palestine.
I'm glad you mentioned the word exclusive.
So thank you, Dr. Lilienthal, for joining us this week. And if I may, I'm going to try to ask some provocative questions and draw you out not just about the history, but about what's happening today in today's Middle East as well.
Fine.
But first, let's go to the history part. How did you first get involved in Middle East affairs and in opposing Israel's creation?
I suppose it was a mad moment looking back on it. Who would write, "Israel's flag is not mine" for the Reader's Digest while living in the heart of Jewish strength in New York City? And I started, there was something about it, the exclusiveness, the putting down of the Palestinians, turning a religion into a nationalism. And I just took to my typewriter or longhand and started to scribble.
What year was that in Reader's Digest?
That was, Reader's Digest article was 1950.
Okay. Israel had already been created.
Israel had been created. Therefore I said Israel's flag is not mine, because everybody else left in doubt whether Israel's flag wasn't theirs.
But as in those years, and I've read about it and you were participating in it, there were many Jews actually who opposed creating an independent Jewish state. My goodness, even the American Jewish Committee only accepted that position in 1943. I mean, before that, the American Jewish Committee, one of the largest Jewish organizations, had been opposed to it.
Even later, I met Judge Proskauer at the UN conference where I was the GI consultant, the American delegation in 1945, and he was still against the idea of an exclusivist Jewish state.
The idea was that both Palestinians and Jews should live in one state where nobody was discriminated against. Actually, the model of the United States, a secular state.
A secular binational or multinational state.
And at the time, there was considerable agreement or considerable support for that position, including the Secretary of State of the United States, as I remember, George Marshall.
Yes, but he bowed to the president's views on it. And the only time he really stood up vigorously is when they tried to push over, Mr. Clark Clifford tried to put over a precipitate recognition of Israel, which would have preceded Israel's declaration of the state.
Well, fair enough, he bowed to it, but he was only the Secretary of State. There was a President of the United States.
That's
but it's interesting for people to remember, too often, especially in the United States, history is pushed aside and never brought forward to explain contemporary events or to help us decide what policies we should now pursue. The same thing in Bosnia.
Sure.
I mean, there's a tremendous history to this conflict. There's a reason the Serbs are fighting for their own exclusivist state. And the same thing happened in Palestine in 1946. There was a civil war. The Palestinians didn't want their state divided. They didn't want it partitioned. The Jews had said up until the early 40s that they too were against a partition, that they simply wanted to live in their homeland, but not to set up an independent Jewish state. But came 1947-48, and people had to decide. A lot of people then took the position, okay, the Jews need to have a state of their own. You, George Marshall, many others took the position that we shouldn't set up tribal, ethnic divisions. That
a state based on a religion. I mean, there were states that adhered, but they didn't freeze out. They didn't become merging of religion and state. And it was against Jewish tradition, too.
Fair enough. So you had your Reader's Digest article.
Yes.
Then, if I recall right, What Price Israel was published a few years later.
Right.
There Goes the Middle East a few years after that. The Zionist Connection in the 70s, I believe. Both of these volumes.
End of the 70s, then an update in 81, and then 4 translations, German, Czech, Japanese, and Arabic of the Zionist connection.
And as I recall, in those years, you were a pretty famous personality in the Middle East. Because of your outspoken opposition,
And
you were
because
welcome in the Arab world.
I went there often enough and
Right.
said what was on my mind, and what was on my mind was closer to their position than it certainly was across the border in Israel.
Right. Because of your opposition, because of being Jewish, American, and anti-Zionist, you were very much welcome throughout the Arab world, if I
Yes.
remember right. Because I've seen pictures of you with the kings and prime ministers of most
I
of the
recently
countries.
did a piece for a very good magazine, which you and I know, Washington Report on the Middle East, called.
Oh, I'm going to ask you about that later. You mean the Saudi publication in Washington?
Is it Saudi? I didn't know. I haven't been getting
The,
any.
the Saudi voice of Middle East affairs.
Anywhere they ran a piece called "The King and I," which described my first tremendous visit to Saudi Arabia.
Oh, to Saudi Arabia. That's what the piece is about.
1953. Yes.
Well, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. As you know, I believe that Washington is full of false flags. Groups saying they are one thing when in reality they are another thing. On the other hand, writers have to have places to publish, and that's one of the reasons these publications exist. But it's also important to understand who funds them, what their priorities are, why they oppose torture and discrimination against Palestinians. But I don't think you'll read any articles in the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs about torture in Saudi Arabia.
No.
All right, back to history. You were at the UN founding meeting.
Yes.
And then
I was. It's worth talking about for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
I was Camp Pickett Hospital, recovering from jaundice, bearing a color that would have made Hirohito envious of me, when I got a call from the American Veterans Committee, which was an adjunct of VFW. Would I like to go to San Francisco to represent them at the UN? At the UN founding conference. I said, wonderful. How do I get there? That's your business. So I took myself out to Andrews and said, have you got a plane leaving for the West Coast? They said, you're in luck. There's a plane warming up. Maybe they have room for you. So I went out, and there was a tough-looking sergeant. I was at PFC. And he said, you want to ride? He said, you can't be very comfortable, but you sit in the back. This is the Sacred Cow, the president's plane, carrying Stettinius, Stassen, Dean Gildersleeve, Congressman Eaton, Bloom, Senator Connolly, and Vandenberg, all going. They were in front, and I was squeezed in the back, but I got a ride out to San Francisco.
Was there any major discussion in San Francisco at the founding meeting of the UN about Palestine?
No, not a word.
Okay.
The only thing was the muted conversation that I had with Judge Joseph Proskauer, who later became president of the American Jewish Committee. But at that moment, he was against the idea of a Jewish state.
I know most American Jews would be flabbergasted to learn these days that the established Jewish community throughout World War II was pretty much against an independent
very much
Jewish
so.
state. And there are lots of ideological and political reasons for that, but I don't want to, we've got a short program, so we've got to sort of move along. Now, this week's quote of the week. Here's what liberal New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis has to say about the current situation in the former Yugoslavia. Quote, the central provision of the agreement proposed by the United States, the creation of a Serbian republic within Bosnia, is a victory for racist fanatics. It legitimizes the terrible proposition that a tribal group in a territory has the right to create its own ethnically pure state, killing or expelling all others. Now, just imagine if, writing about history of not that long ago, when the U.S. also helped bring about the partition in another foreign land, Lewis were to write, quote, the central provision of the agreement proposed by the United States, the creation of a Jewish republic within Palestine, is a victory for racist fanatics. It legitimizes the terrible proposition that a tribal group in a territory has the right to create its own ethnically pure state, killing or expelling all others, unquote. Differences, of course, including the fact that the Serbs have lived continually in the areas they claim for millennium, while the great majority of the Jews who were in Palestine in 1948 were there because of slaughter and expulsion from a Europe saturated by virulent anti-Semitism. but for which the Palestinians had no responsibility. It's time for historical justice to be done. Either the Palestinians should have a fully sovereign and independent Palestinian state with Arab Jerusalem as its capital, or there should be one multinational state in what was Palestine, where all will have equal rights and where today's variant of Middle East apartheid must finally be ended. Were you also at the UN in the 47-48 period when there was the huge debate over Palestine?
Oh yes, at Lake Success.
Okay. Tell us a bit about that.
I was there.
That debate.
Well, I was presenting the views in opposition to partition.
On whose behalf?
American Council for Judaism, the Lessing Rosenwald Elmer Berger organization.
At the time, there was an actual sort of establishment Jewish group opposed to the idea.
The only one of about 16 groups in 1947 that were actively opposed to the idea of the creation of an independent state of Israel. And I talked to enough delegates to think that we were going to win the battle, but then the real squeeze was put on them. We won't give you trade, we won't do this, and there were all kinds of pressures, all of which I cite in What Price Israel, the battle for partition. And on that fateful day, November the 29th, they put it off for 2 days, so they were sure of two-thirds majority, and they got the two-thirds majority.
Well, there too, history is fascinating. As you know, for some years I represented the World Jewish Congress, but it was a very different World Jewish Congress. It was the World Jewish Congress of Nahum Goldman.
Not Bronfman's.
Not Bronfman's Israeli Jewish Congress.
Right.
But Nahum Goldman at the time, who was the Zionist representative in Washington and one of the leading Jewish personalities in the world, he also wanted to delay, at minimum, to delay establishing a Jewish state.
Right.
He thought an agreement could be reached with the Arabs for some sort of unified state.
Both sides miscalculated, both the Israelis to be and the Jewish lobby and the Arabs. They could have reached some kind of agreement, but the Arabs were obdurate. They weren't thinking of any kind of a compromise at that moment. They didn't want any kind of a Jewish state, binational or otherwise, unfortunate. And of course, Israel, the pro-Israeli faction, wanted a Jewish state. Not binational, but a Jewish state. No one thought of teaming together their ideas and setting up what was natural, more natural then than it is now, a binational.
But in a sense, it was a conflict waiting to happen. The Jews had been decimated in the crematoriums and the ovens of Nazi Germany and occupied Europe. They had nowhere to go. The Americans were turning away refugee ships. It wasn't as if the refugees of Europe had anywhere to go.
They could have gone if the same amount of pressure that was put on countries to support partition in the state of Palestine had been put on countries to open their doors.
Fair enough. But
even my good friend Bill Stratton in Congress, then later governor, Bill is still alive amongst the living like I am, and he remembers the terrible days where he tried to persuade Congress to open the doors of the United States to allow NDPs
Fair enough. But Europe and America essentially dumped the Jews on Palestine.
Exactly.
The British armed and prepared both sides for conflict and then withdrew. The UN passed all kinds of resolutions but did nothing, even when their own negotiator was killed by the Zionists.
Friend of mine, Count Foky Bernadotte, and this horrible distortion of what Bernadotte did and stood for by Katie Martin is a blemish.
Hey, these are people I haven't heard of, so I'm sure the viewers haven't heard of them.
The book has gotten a big play.
But for viewers who don't remember this part of history, the UN had a negotiator, Count Bernadotte.
Count Foky Bernadotte.
He was killed. Believe it or not, a lot of viewers are going to really marvel at this. He was killed by a faction of the Zionist armed
Leahy, the Stern Gang, more familiarly known as the Stern Gang.
And none other than former Prime Minister Shamir was one of 3 or 4 members of the gang that killed him.
Who passed his life sentence, right.
All right. It's history, but in a sense, it remains very vivid because although there's a so-called peace process taking place today, the basic conflict continues. There are Palestinians demanding their rights. There are Jews demanding an independent Jewish state. Some people call it apartheid. Some people call it the beginning of a settlement. Some people, like Edward Said, call Yasser Arafat a collaborator. I don't think any of us know where this is going to end up.
No.
But
nowhere good, I can say.
But going back to the 50s or 60s, tell us just a bit about the Arab world at that time. It was the time when the kings were consolidating their hold over Jordan, over Saudi Arabia. There had been a revolution in Egypt. Tell us a bit about that time and a bit about what the Arabs expected would happen in Palestine.
Well, at first they thought they could, by words, never by arms, push Israel into the sea. The Arabs are very, very good verbally. There's an old expression, kalam, kalam, bidun mana, words, words without meaning. And there's no one who does a better job than the Arabs. They fool even themselves, and they thought they could make Israel disappear. They hadn't counted on one person, though, Adolf Hitler, and the tremendous influence that the Nazi genocide had on making up America's mind. That and the vote and the money coming in for campaigns, those are the three factors that created Israel.
Fair enough, but let's be clear. Most of my family was killed in the Holocaust. I'm sure many of your relatives were killed in the Holocaust. The trauma that the Jewish people were subjected to during the Nazi period, which the Palestinians had nothing to do with.
Exactly.
This was Christian Europe that destroyed the Jews.
And why not set up the state in the heart of Christian Europe?
Fair enough, but coming out of that experience with no place for the refugees to go, with the West turning away the ships that were carrying the refugees, I suspect had I been alive, and this is probably a difference, but I've always thought that had I been alive, having to make a choice at that time, and it wouldn't have been a good choice, I probably would have been trying to raise funds or arms for the new Jewish state, not understanding what was happening to the people who live there, the Palestinians. And as we both know, and you showed me some papers before we went on the air, you showed me the great majority of Palestine was then populated by Arab Palestinians.
93% at the time of the Balfour Declaration, which is the legal under 1913, 1917 period, was either Jewish, was either Muslim or Christian. There are Christians, people forget, in that part of the world, Arab, 7%. At the time of partition, there were influx of many, many Jews, and it was still 66% Arab and only 33% Jewish.
Fair enough. I'm Mark Bruzonsky. You're watching Mideast Realities. We'll be right back with Dr. Alfred Lilienthal, but now, our lie of the week. And now, this week's lie of the week. Quote, "The Civil War has begun. This is the moment before the first fatality. It does not matter who is the first victim, a soldier or a settler." This is Geula Cohen, a right-wing, well-known Israeli personality, writing in the Israeli daily Ma'ariv. Now, there is tension in Israel, but hardly civil war. And this tension actually plays right into the hands of the Israeli Labor Party, right into the strategy of Rabin and Peres for liquidating the Palestinian issue from world attention, and ironically, right into the hands of Yasser Arafat as well. By giving the impression that they're battling mightily against their own people, the Israelis managed to shift the focus of attention away from Palestinian independence and statehood, away from still further Israeli settlements in key areas, most especially Jerusalem, and away from the process of locking Palestinians into reservations, while keeping them divided from each other both physically and politically. Furthermore, by allowing the impression of potential civil war, the Labor Party is able to use the fear engendered to get both the American government and the wealthy liberal American Jewish community on their team in the run-up to next year's elections. And still furthermore, even if the Likud should win in the next Israeli election, this too plays into the hands of the Israelis. First of all, they will tout the virtues of their apartheid-style democracy. That's democracy for Jews, but not for the Palestinian majority. As for Arafat, now in partnership with his longtime enemies against a large faction of his own people, such rantings by Geula Cohen also serve his interests, for he too is then able to argue to his own people that Rabin and Peres are really doing all they can, when in fact They've essentially taken him to the cleaners. We're here with Dr. Alfred Lilienthal. We're talking about history, about people and events that I've read a great deal about, but you lived through, you knew them all. So throughout the 50s and the 60s, my impression is you were not only writing these books, but you were going back and forth to the Middle East.
That's right, because at the end of the 60s, I started to edit and publish a monthly newsletter called Middle East Perspective, and was a registered representative at the United Nations, so I could see everything that was going there from the press galleries, and could see how the press still was warping, twisting. I was saying the big disease of this period and of subsequent periods was what I call myth information, and I don't lisp, not miss, but myth information.
Well, wars and brutality have a way of bringing forward myths and all kinds of emotions that otherwise... The transformation of the Jewish community from a non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist community before World War II,
Right.
that had very clear ideological reasons why it didn't want to see a Jewish state. Our community, our American Jewish community, since we're both Jewish, basically believed very strongly in the secular state model, the United States. The idea of ethnic groups breaking up along national lines was very much something that most American Jews opposed, up until Hitler. Hitler's the one that created this internal Jewish cohesion, and then provided, of course, the human fodder which ended up in Palestine. I mean, after the Holocaust, it's very understandable that the Jews were so scarred and so traumatized that the idea that they were not going to fight went against everything they just
But I can see we're going to have a fight.
Please.
It's not American Jewish community, it's Jewish American. I do not believe, and I've written this strongly against the injustice done to the Palestinians, against the grave injustice to transform what is a Jewish community into a ethnic group. I don't think the Jews are an ethnic people, but that would take another broadcast.
Fine, that ideologically, that's
So it should
terribly
be-
interesting, but you reflect the fact that you're in your 80s, and when you grew up, that's the way it was phrased. I'm in my 40s, and when I grew up, I phrased it the way I learned it.
Jewish American is what I prefer to American Jewish.
And even today, I don't, for instance, consider myself an anti-Zionist. I consider myself a pro-Palestinian rights person, meaning that it's terrible what was done and continues to be done to the Palestinians. And
No quarrel with me.
And if it were up to me, the secular state model would be the nice one, and everybody would be a citizen, nobody would be discriminated, no pass laws, no restricted land ownership covenants. But unfortunately, the best we can expect in the short term in the Middle East is a truly independent Palestinian state.
Two-state solution.
Not what we've got now. What we've got now
no.
is reservations and Bantustans.
Right, right.
Sort of Yasser Arafat as warden of the Palestinians. But before we get to contemporary things, let's continue with your own saga, if we will.
So I used to go to the UN, and to cover it, meet personalities, meet prime, and then I was invited and kept going out to the Middle East. In all, I made 27 trips to the area between being there as a GI in 1943 and going back on my last trip, which was last year in 1992.
Now, there's the difference between us two. It's amazing how the world has changed. You were going in the era of prop planes and boats when you first started. I started going to the Middle East as a student in the 70s, and unbelievably have made over 150 trips to the region.